Thank you so much for joining the podcast with us this week. Cara, we're going to begin with, I suppose, the EPA report last week pointing to the fact that there needs to be urgent implementation in terms of the climate plans and policies. In terms of Ireland's target to reduce the emissions by 51% by 2030, how are we doing with that?
Well, what the EPA report that came out last week said was that even if we implement all of the plans in the last climate action plan, which was published in 2019, we will only reduce emissions by about 28% between now and 2030. And while that's enough to meet our EU obligations, unfortunately, we've actually raised the bar since then. The new government has put in a target of 51% by 2030. So we are not going to meet that target based on the current action plan, which means we need to create a new action plan.
So is that to say, Cara, that we've gone to the likes of COP26, we've signed up to all these global treaties where we're going to agree to try and slash our emissions by half, and we've legislated for carbon budgets and all that other sort of stuff, but we haven't actually produced any plan on how we're actually going to reduce our emissions?
Well, part of the problem with that is the timing. So we had a new government. They created a new climate action plan relatively soon after they came into government. And then the new legislation was passed. So we always knew this was going to be an issue. And they have always committed to doing another climate action plan that's in line with the new legislation. So that means that we should see a new climate action plan around about September or November of this year. And we would hope that that plan has to come up with enough plans and policies that we actually do hit that 51% target. So it's more of a timing issue than an issue of failure at this stage.
Cara, can I ask why in Ireland we seem to constantly, every single year, maybe twice or three times a year, we hear how we are lagging far behind what our climate targets are and that we are going to be in line for serious fines as the financial or the economic cost of this. But obviously the detriment of our planet is the ultimate problem here. Why are we consistently falling behind what we should be doing? Like, what sectors in Ireland or what industries or what elements of Irish society and business have really sort of let us down in this?
Well, part of the reason is that, of course, the longer we take to not do anything and to kick the can down the road, the more we have to do later on to meet those targets. So it gets harder and harder the more we delay. At the moment now, we're at the process where each of the sectors are setting their sectoral emissions targets, is what they say. So what they're going to do to stay within these new carbon budgets. So they're going to divide up the pie essentially between these sectors. And obviously, electricity has been leading the way, and that we have a lot of wind turbines now. They've been doing pretty well, and they have a vision to completely decarbonize by around 2036. So that's very positive. Transport, not so much. And of course, as the economy grows and we come out of COVID, we're seeing the emissions from transport going way up again. So we really need that kind of sustainable and active transport to come into play. And that's going to take time. When we build these cycle lanes and we start creating more public transport, it takes time to start seeing the emissions going down from that. And the big question mark now is with agriculture, because there's just been a blind spot essentially to their obligation to reduce emissions for a really long time. And a lot of energy has been wasted by the agricultural sector in saying that they shouldn't necessarily have to do anything or have to do as much to meet those targets. So they're not being asked to do as much. They're being asked to do somewhere between 22 and 30% emissions reductions compared to about 50% from the other sectors. But they're still saying even that's too much for them. So that's going to be the big question mark going forward.
Just one thing that I sort of feel watching the political debate around climate change in this country is, you know, how much we long finger things, how much we put things back, how often we seem to be revel as a government and as a society and we can call it out as a problem. So Ireland, I think, was the second country in the world to declare a climate emergency, and yet we still don't meet our targets. We're good on climate talk, but climate action is a different thing entirely. I mean, do you feel that the likelihood is that we're still going to be debating things like the carbon tax, like farm emissions, like, you know, transport and energy production at a time when, you know, things have already changed too far? I mean, we're talking about the 1.5 degrees increase in global temperatures and how detrimental that will be for all of us. Like, what are we seeing around the world as we speak that should be setting off alarm bells to us that we have probably let things go too far already?
I think what we're seeing in Ireland is that the current government is far more progressive on climate action than we've seen in any government. So we have a lot more ambitious plans and policies being committed to, but the question is around implementation. So are those going to be implemented fast enough to get the emissions down? I mean, we're seeing commitments from the current minister, Eamon Ryan, that things will start happening in the next 2 years, that they're really accelerating things in the same way that the government accelerated action around COVID. So hopefully that will happen and that will be really positive. But I think every country around the world is struggling with some. The Biden administration in the US is saying that they're really worried about meeting their energy targets, that the whole solar industry has completely collapsed in America because of trade issues with China. So it's not easy for any country to make this big transformation away from fossil fuels. And I think Ireland, it's probably harder for us because we've left it so late.
And Cara, in terms of engagement in all of this, of course, we're seeing huge action, particularly from younger people, and it's really refreshing to see that. But there's always going to be people who sort of aren't engaged in this, who'll say, oh, it's kind of not really my problem, or I'm not that interested in it. Was it fair to say that if you're not panicking at this point, then you clearly don't understand the problem?
Yeah, but I think it's human nature to not panic and to try and, to go, oh my God, that's shocking, and then forget about it later. We see that with all sorts of problems. We see it in America with gun control legislation, and every time there's a shooting, that's the only thing on the airwaves, and then people very quickly forget. And maybe that's part of being human, and it's hard to get your head around these big global challenges. But certainly the news is shocking and terrifying, and if you read it every day like I do, then you're very aware that our future is very precarious, and the future of our children is very precarious, and life is going to get much harder very quickly if we don't take action soon and try and halt or limit global warming.
What do you say, Cara, to the argument that some other, I don't want to say climate skeptics, but people who are a bit sort of negative or skeptical about the necessity for countries like Ireland to do anything? They'll always put the argument that, major corporations are responsible for so many emissions, or larger industrial countries like the USA or China are responsible for so much, that in the grand scheme of things, if Ireland were not to meet its obligations, it would only be a drop in the ocean, that it's those bigger countries that really carry the sway, and that therefore Ireland really shouldn't be forcing citizens to make uncomfortable choices about their lives just to save the planet, when they're not going to be the ones that make the difference.
Yeah, it's the number one question that gets asked in the media, actually. And the truth is, if every country took that attitude that we're only small and what we do doesn't matter, a quarter of emissions are represented by countries like Ireland that are less than 2% of emissions globally. So all the small countries also have to do their part in order to solve climate change. A quarter of emissions is as big as the United States. So we all need to chip in to do it. And as to the question about whether, it's corporations, of course, you can say it's corporations that are contributing to emissions, but they're contributing because we as individuals choose to buy their products. So we drive those emissions from corporations, and we drive those emissions from China in particular, because we buy a lot of our products from China. So the carbon footprint of a country or of people in China individually is much smaller than people in Western Europe and in the United States. But it's the fact that they manufacture all these goods for people like us that drives their emissions upwards.
Cara, for people who are looking for real world or real life examples about what might happen here within the next couple of decades as a result of climate change, is there anything you could point to around the world as an example of the sort of climate changing in a very obvious and detrimental way that we could expect to happen here without the sort of action that we need to take, and which we obviously haven't taken so far?
Yeah, I think for Ireland, there's a few things. So sea level rise is going to be a big problem globally, but what researchers are finding in the Newth University is that sea level rise is happening in places like Dublin much faster than they predicted, and to a much greater extent than other parts of the world. So that's a big concern for people who live near the coast, which is a majority of our population. And it's also a big concern for our infrastructure. So if you think about our Dart line, for example, it is right on the ocean, and it's at huge risk of falling into the sea because of climate change. And then I think the other big risk for us is on food production, because a majority of our food is actually imported from other countries. So when they struggle with a changing climate, as we're seeing in places like India right now, that affects the ability for them to be able to export food to us. So particularly when it comes to grain right now, the Ukraine isn't able to produce grain because of their conflict. And India said they would step in and be able to fill that gap. But now India is experiencing an incredible drought across the country. So I think we're going to start to see food prices go up, and that's going to affect us here in Ireland. And food availability eventually will affect us too. So that is the big concern, I think, for us here in Ireland.
That is the reality of it. Dr. Cara Augustenborg, thank you so much for joining the group chat. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.